Oh, here you are, face to face in this trashy bar. Another glass and I am going places. Makes me laugh about the irony of everything. I like the way you're thinking.
Oh hey, it's Wes, and today we're having a look at one of my favorite lens manufacturers, the new lens, the TTartisan 50 2.0. So TTartisan is most known for their APS-C manual focus lenses, but recently they've made some full frame lenses. TTartisan essentially has two different lens lineups, the 21 1.5. This lens is more a part of their ultra-wide aperture lens lineups. Now, this is also a full frame lens, but if you look at their lineup, they have some like 0.95 lenses, and honestly, they all have kind of the same look to them on the side here. But that doesn't look like this lens, which is more like their 51.2, their 35, and their other APS-C lenses. These ultra-wide aperture lens series, these have kind of a more vintage look to them, whereas their more standard APS-C lens lineup, they have a very modern, crisp character, and that's where this one fits in. It's very similar to the other TTartisan lenses that I've reviewed in the past on APS-C. As always, starting with the categories, number one being the build quality. This is a tiny lens. It's kind of shocking that this is a full frame lens. A little dust on here. Don't use your shirt to wipe your lenses. Stop that, Wes. Look how small this is. Mounted on a full frame Sony camera, this lens just disappears. It's almost a pancake lens. That's crazy. Now, you do have the rangefinder style metal lens hood. Makes it a little bit bigger and honestly is classy as all get out. But you just take the lens itself, boy is it tiny. It comes with a lens cap, just the most generic of plastic lens caps, which doesn't really work well once you have the lens hood on, and you have the most generic of lens back caps. Now, as you can see, it is externally focusing. Even when you go all the way though, it still doesn't get very big. A clicked aperture ring, can't be declicked, but I prefer having a clicked aperture ring. It's a little harder to bump. But overall, it is fairly easy to bump because this lens is so small, there is very little room to put your fingers, which is a bit of an issue when you're mounting and dismounting the lens. As you can see, the only non-moving part of this lens is this teeny tiny little ring around the side here, which has just a couple tiny little grips on it. On the back here, you can see we have no weather sealing, just smooth chrome metal. But it's all metal, very light. I'm going to give this an 8 out of 10 for build quality, fairly standard for our metal third-party lenses. Moving on to the next category, handling and usability. An obvious win for this lens is that it is just vanishingly tiny. That is a ton of points. Now, an obvious loss for it is that it is quite easy to bump the aperture ring. But another win is the knurling design on the focus ring and the dampening. Just the overall feel of this lens is just top-notch. But we don't have a chipped design here to do automatic focus assist. Not convinced there would be room in this tiny lens for that, but most other lenses I would like to see it. And as I said before, mounting and dismounting this lens is a bit of a pain, but overall that is an 8 out of 10. It is sharp enough for focus peaking to work fantastically, so this is a fun and tiny lens to use. Image quality. Now, if you didn't know TTartisan, I'm willing to bet that you would be thinking that the image quality on this lens is going to just be garbage based on the price and the size of this lens. But I've got to tell you, this is getting back to the TTartisan roots of making lenses that are fantastically sharp and modern with great rendition, and that is what this is. Chromatic aberration is surprisingly well controlled, but then again, our widest aperture is 2.0, so it's not like an ultra-wide aperture, but it's not that bad either. It is somewhat resistant to flaring, surprisingly so for its size and price. And once you stop this down just the slightest bit, say 2.8, this lens cannot be distinguished from lenses that are 6 to 10 times its price. And I'm not joking here. In the studio, I use this lens for a lot of stuff and it looks amazing. You literally cannot tell that you're shooting on a dirt cheap, teeny tiny manual focus lens if you get the focus in. And you can get the focus in pretty easily because it is so sharp. Focus peaking works great. Overall, I am going to give this an 8.5 out of 10 for image quality. Probably the highest image quality rating I've given for such a cheap full frame lens. It's fantastic. If you want to see larger and more image samples, check out my link down in the description below. You'll find those on my website. Image character. Much like previous TTartisan lenses, it's a bit dry. There's nothing interesting going on here, and because this is only an f2 lens, you're not going to get like a lot of shallow depth of field, but again, we're at 50 mil, so it's not that bad either. You can get some great bokeh with this lens. It's smooth and easy and round, it doesn't get super nervous. A little bit of cat's eye around the edges. I would have expected more cat's eye given the size of this lens and how small everything seems. Very light soap bubbling, which I actually prefer, and largely free of onion ringing. This is surprising. While it's just a little bit boring in the character field, you could freelance with this lens and have some fun as well, so that's fantastic. It's a little bit dry, but you can still have some fun. I'm gonna give this a 7.5 out of 10. Autofocus. It has none, but it also doesn't have focus contacts to communicate and do automatic focus assist, so that's a shame. But again, focus peaking works great with this lens. But overall, I have to give it a 0 out of 10 in case you're cross-shopping to, say, the 50 1.8 from Sony, which is a pretty cheap lens, not as cheap as this. But there's also going to be a separate rating scale for just manual focus lenses later on. Value. This is where things get pretty obvious. This lens is $70. I doubt that there is another lens out there that is as sharp, reliably sharp as this lens for 70 bucks. I can only give it a 10 out of 10, but honestly, I would give it a higher rating than that. But I am bound by the confines of math and science here. This is, bang for your buck, the sharpest lens that has ever been created, in my mind. It's just redonkulous. Now, is it sharper than, say, the Sony 55 1.8, the Sony Zeiss? Honestly, I would say it trades blows with it. And it is less than 1/10 the price. Around the edges, this isn't quite as sharp. Not quite, but pretty close, because that Sony 55 is not that sharp around the edges. So if you don't need autofocus, this lens is going to get the job done really well for you. Now we can compare that to, there's a Mikey 1.7 50mm lens for $109. There's another TTartisan, a 51.4 for $225, and the Sony 51.8 is $250. These are all cheap lenses, and they cost way more than this lens does. I could go on with a bunch of more expensive stuff, but there's no reason to do that. This is obviously a 10 out of 10 for value. One of the easiest numbers I have ever had to come up with for any rating in any video ever. It's 10 out of 10. That gives us a total of 42.5 out of 50, or 84% on the manual focus lens scale. Let's see how that compares. And we get a 70% on the absolute scale, which honestly, let me look at this scale here. Okay, that's pretty high, and it outranks some autofocus lenses, but we lose a lot of points because it doesn't have autofocus. If TTartisan could make this lens, even with bad autofocus, they would kill. But even as it stands, this lens is just a no-brainer. A full-frame lens with this kind of quality at that price. Yeah, it's not as good as a lot of more expensive lenses, but just the price is ridiculous. Okay, if you want to pick up one of these lenses, I've got links down in the description below. Let me know what you thought about this lens, and do you think it's as crazy a value as I do? Let me know. I would love to talk to you about that down in the comments below. But until next time, let's go take some photos. On the cheap.